What if I told you that the man who shook America to its core looked just like the guy next door? A bright, articulate law student. A man with a charming smile. The kind of face you trust. The kind of presence that disarms suspicion. But behind that carefully constructed mask was a darkness so deep, so calculating, that even seasoned detectives struggled to comprehend what they were up against. This is not fiction. This is the terrifying, real-life story of Ted Bundy, one of the most infamous serial killers in American history. Bundy wasn't just a murderer. He was a manipulator, a predator, and a master of disguise, not with makeup or costumes, but with charisma and control. His victims weren't just taken, they were tricked, convinced, lured in by a man who understood how to play the role of normal better than anyone else. Between 1974 and 1978, Bundy launched a cross-country killing spree that would leave a trail of devastation across at least 7 states. He would eventually confess to murdering 30 young women, but experts believe the number may have been far higher, possibly even triple digits. He escaped police custody twice, represented himself in court with an unsettling flair for performance, married a woman during his murder trial, smiled for cameras while facing death row, and through it all, he never once lost that polished, almost arrogant confidence until the very end. On January 24, 1989, Ted Bundy was executed in the electric chair at Florida State Prison. Outside, hundreds of people gathered, cheering, holding signs, banging on drums. It was a rare moment in American justice, when even strangers found unity in the conclusion of something so horrific. But this story isn't about justice. It's about deception, about the terrifying gap between appearance and reality, about the victims who were taken too soon, and the chilling realization that evil doesn't always look like a monster. It looks like Ted. And this is the true crime story of how one man fooled nation. Stay with me. The story you're about to hear isn't just disturbing, it's unforgettable. Ted Bundy entered this world on November 24, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont, under circumstances already shadowed in deception. He was born Theodore Robert Cowell, but even his birth certificate couldn't offer a clear answer to the question that would haunt his early life. Who was his real father? His mother, Eleanor Louise Cowell, just 22 at the time, had fled to the Elizabeth Lund home for unwed mothers, a decision driven by the crushing stigma of raising a child alone in post-war America. But instead of facing that shame, she handed her newborn son a different kind of burden. A lie. From birth, Ted was raised to believe his grandparents were his parents. And his mother? He called her his sister. That charade would shape everything that came after. The family soon moved to Philadelphia. Bundy's grandfather, Samuel Cowell, was known to be a short-tempered man, a devout churchgoer with a cruel streak. Reports described him as volatile, someone who beat animals, hurled furniture in anger, and held deeply racist, violent views. Young Ted, observant and eerily intelligent, grew up in that volatile environment, watching, absorbing, mimicking. As a child, he seemed different. There are stories, unconfirmed but chilling, that he once surrounded his sleeping aunt with kitchen knives, just to see what would happen. Classmates remember him as quiet, polite, and oddly detached. One neighbor recalled how he would roam the streets at night, peering into windows, just watching, never blinking. By the time his mother moved them to Tacoma, Washington, and married Johnny Bundy, giving Ted his new surname, it was already too late. Ted didn't bond with his stepfather. He resented him, saw him as ordinary. Ted had bigger ideas about who he was, and who he wanted the world to believe he was. In high school, he struggled to fit in, but he learned quickly how to imitate charm. He studied people, mirrored their mannerisms. It wasn't genuine, but it was effective. This was the beginning of what psychologists would later call his mask of sanity. Bundy wasn't charismatic. He was rehearsed. He didn't feel empathy. He performed it. And yet, by college, he began to look like the American dream. Handsome, intelligent, well-spoken. He studied psychology. He volunteered at a crisis hotline. Yes, the man who would go on to kill dozens of women once comforted people in their darkest hours. His colleague at the time, author and Rule, would later write one of the most chilling accounts of his crimes, titled The Stranger Beside Me, because even she didn't see what was hiding beneath the surface. But psychologists would later dig deeper. Some debated whether Bundy was bipolar, citing sudden mood swings and erratic behavior. Others landed on something colder, psychopathy, complete emotional detachment, no empathy, no guilt, only calculation. Dr. Dorothy Lewis, a psychiatrist who evaluated Bundy on death row, described something even more disturbing. She believed Bundy suffered from an abnormal brain function, a disconnect between his emotional and logical processing. In her words, he had no inner sense of right and wrong. Lewis suspected dissociative states, moments where Bundy split from reality to indulge in his fantasies without consequence. But even in these sessions, Bundy didn't come across as a monster. He was polite, articulate, chillingly self-aware. And that's the horror of it. Ted Bundy didn't fit the mold. He wasn't a loner in a trench coat. He wasn't a stranger lurking in the dark. He was the guy who smiled, opened doors, and offered to help you carry your books. He was the boyfriend who remembered your birthday, the law student with a bright future. He was also the man who, beneath it all, was already fantasizing about domination, control, and death. The transformation was slow, deliberate, and hidden behind the most convincing mask America had ever seen. But masks eventually slip, and Ted Bundy's would crack in ways the world could never have prepared for. In January of 1974, Seattle was buried under a cold, gray winter. But something far more chilling was about to descend on the Pacific Northwest. A nightmare that began not with a scream, but with a whisper of a girl who vanished into the night without a trace. Her name was Karen Sparks, a 21-year-old student at the University of Washington, living in a basement apartment near campus. On January 4th, someone broke into her home while she slept. He beat her with a metal rod and sexually assaulted her using that same instrument. Karen survived, but barely. She would spend 10 days in a coma. When she awoke, she had no memory of what had happened. The trauma left her with permanent brain damage. But this was just the beginning. Exactly 1 month later, on February 1st, 1974, Linda and Healy, a bright, outgoing 21-year-old student, disappeared from her basement room in a house she shared with friends. Linda was known for her soft voice, her radio weather reports, and her kindness. That morning, her bed was made neatly. Her pillow was stained with blood. Her bike was untouched, and she was gone. No forced entry, no signs of struggle, just absence. Weeks passed, then months. More women disappeared, each of them young, white, with long dark hair parted down the middle. They vanished without warning, always from nearby college campuses, always without witnesses. Police were baffled. Theories multiplied, but answers remained elusive. Bundy had begun to develop a method, a sinister pattern. He learned to impersonate authority, posing as a police officer or sometimes as an injured man with his arm in a sling, struggling to carry books or load his car. His cast would evoke sympathy, his good looks trust. Once a young woman offered to help, it was already too late. He would strike them on the head with a blunt object, drag them into his car, often a beige Volkswagen Beetle, modified to remove the passenger seat and control the locks. Then he would drive to a secluded location, often hours away, where he would do things too horrific to describe. And when it was over, he wouldn't just walk away. Sometimes he returned to the crime scenes. He returned. One of the most haunting cases was that of Georgianne Hawkins. On the night of June 10, 1974, Georgianne left her sorority house around midnight to visit her boyfriend in a nearby frat. The walk was short, the alley dimly lit. She was never seen again. Bundy would later confess he used a crutch that night, pretending to struggle with his books. Georgianne, compassionate and unaware, offered to help. And in that moment, her fate was sealed. He struck her, took her, drove away. Later, Bundy would describe how she regained consciousness in his car and began talking, still thinking he was someone else, maybe a fellow student who needed help with Spanish homework. And then silence. For police, these crimes posed an impossible puzzle. The killer left almost no trace. There was no DNA evidence in 1974, no surveillance cameras. Witnesses were few, and those who came forward described different suspects, until a pattern started to form. A name, or rather, a first name, Ted. Several survivors and witnesses said the man introduced himself as Ted. They described him as attractive, well-dressed, and friendly, not the image anyone associated with a killer. Sketches were drawn, composites released. Still, few believed the man in the drawings could be capable of such atrocities. One woman even told police she thought she recognized the man from the sketch. He was a law student she knew. His name? Ted Bundy. But the tip went nowhere. Because how could someone so clean-cut, so articulate, be capable of this? That was Bundy's greatest weapon. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like someone you'd sit next to on a bus. Like someone who might offer you a ride. Like someone who could be your friend. And that made him invisible. As summer gave way to fall, the number of missing women continued to rise. Desperation grew. And still, Bundy walked among them, laughing, studying, smiling. Because Ted Bundy was just getting started. By the fall of 1974, Ted Bundy had become something else. Something far more dangerous than just a predator stalking college campuses. He was now a drifter with a blueprint, a killer with a purpose, expanding his territory like a storm moving across the western United States. From Washington, Bundy moved south into Oregon, then east into Idaho, next Utah, and finally Colorado. With each new state, the nightmare followed. Young women vanished, always the same type, brunette, petite, parted hair. Always the same method, approach, lure, strike, disappear. And with every state line crossed, Bundy bought himself time. Jurisdictions didn't share information the way they do now. The lack of communication between law enforcement agencies gave him the freedom to kill without pattern, at least one that authorities could easily track. But it was in Utah where Bundy's killing spree began to unravel. On November 8, 1974, in the quiet town of Murray, Utah, 18-year-old Carol Duranch was shopping at the local mall when she was approached by a man who identified himself as Officer Roseland. He told her someone had tried to break into her car. She followed him to his brown Volkswagen Beetle. It was a decision that would change her life forever. As soon as she stepped inside, something felt wrong. There was no radio in the car, no police markings. And then came the sudden shift. The man attempted to handcuff her, but only one cuff latched. The other dangled loose. Carol fought back, screamed, kicked, scratched. She managed to escape the car and run into the street, flagging down help. Carol Duranch survived. She was the first to do so. And with her survival came something Bundy hadn't expected. A living witness. Someone who could describe his face, his car, and the terror he unleashed. Police began watching the area more closely. They traced reports of similar vehicles. And finally, in August of 1975, Bundy was pulled over in Granger, Utah. A search of his car revealed a ski mask, a crowbar, handcuffs, and rope. He was arrested. But this was Bundy. Arrest didn't mean defeat. It meant performance. He charmed the detectives. He refused to panic. He denied everything. No, he didn't know Carol. No, he hadn't done anything wrong. He played the part of the wrongly accused, the misunderstood law student caught in a web of confusion. Still, charges were filed. And by March 1976, he was convicted of kidnapping Carol Duranch and sentenced to 1 to 15 years in prison. But behind the scenes, investigators in Colorado were building something stronger. A murder case. In January 1977, Bundy was transferred to Aspen, Colorado, to stand trial for the murder of Karen Campbell, a 23-year-old nurse who had disappeared from a hotel hallway during a family ski trip in Snowmass. Bundy now faced a possible death sentence. So he did what he did best. He adapted. Representing himself in court, he gained access to the law library in the Aspen courthouse. There, without handcuffs or guards hovering, Bundy prepared and plotted. On June 7, 1977, during a routine visit to the library, Bundy opened a window and jumped 2 stories down into the forest. He vanished. For 6 days, the town of Aspen was paralyzed with fear. A killer was loose in the mountains. But Bundy had injured his ankle during the escape, and without supplies, he was recaptured wandering in the woods, cold and hungry. Yet it wasn't over. Back in custody, Bundy waited, watched, pretended to cooperate. And then, in December 1977, just 6 months after his first escape, he did it again. This time, it was even more daring. He sawed a hole in the ceiling of his jail cell, lost weight to squeeze through it, climbed into the crawl space above, then dropped down into an empty apartment used by jail staff. He walked out the front door. While police were searching the mountains, Ted Bundy got on a plane and disappeared. No one knew where he'd gone. Not yet. But the answer would soon emerge in Florida, with blood. A lot of it. Bundy was far from done. He was just accelerating. It was just after 3 a.m. on January 15, 1978. Most of the residents inside Florida State University's Chi Omega sorority house were fast asleep. Finals were over. A new semester had begun. Tallahassee was quiet. But in the span of less than 15 minutes, that quiet shattered. Ted Bundy, fresh off his second escape from custody, had made his way across the country to Florida, slipping through airports, changing his appearance, stealing IDs. He was a fugitive, and he was hunting. That night, he entered the Chi Omega house undetected. No forced entry, no alarms. He picked up a piece of firewood from outside the building and walked through the front door like he belonged there. Inside, the horror unfolded with terrifying precision. Bundy entered the first room and bludgeoned Margaret Bowman, age 21, to death in her bed. Then, without hesitation, he moved into Lisa Levy's room. She too was attacked, beaten, strangled, sexually assaulted. Bundy bit her, hard, leaving a distinct and brutal bite mark on her body. She died from her injuries. But he didn't stop there. He continued down the hallway, entering the rooms of Kathy Kleiner and Karen Chandler. Both were viciously beaten, bones shattered, faces disfigured. But somehow they survived. It wasn't skill or planning. It was time. A roommate returning home interrupted him. He vanished into the night before police arrived. What they found was pure savagery. Blood, hair, broken teeth, fractured skulls. But one piece of evidence would later prove critical: the bite mark on Lisa Levy. That single impression would become a cornerstone of the case against him. Forensic odontologists would testify that the bite matched Bundy's unique dental pattern. It was one of the earliest uses of bite mark analysis in a murder trial, and it would help seal his fate. But Bundy wasn't done. Just 3 weeks later, on February 9, 1978, in Lake City, Florida, 12-year-old Kimberly Leach was seen leaving her school. She never made it to her next class. Witnesses said a strange man had been seen near the school in a white van. Days turned into weeks. And then the worst was confirmed. Her body was found nearly 2 months later in a pig shed near Suwannee River State Park. She had been raped and murdered. This was Bundy's youngest known victim, and the brutality of the crime would shake even hardened investigators. Kimberly wasn't a co-ed. She wasn't lured from a bar or parking lot. She was a child taken in broad daylight. Bundy's unraveling was complete. He was arrested just a week after Kimberly's disappearance. Not by an FBI raid, not through brilliant detective work, but by pure chance. In the early hours of February 15, 1978, a Pensacola police officer noticed a suspicious orange Volkswagen Beetle parked awkwardly. The tags were stolen. Inside was a man who gave a false name, resisted arrest, and then finally gave in. In the car, stolen IDs, multiple licenses, hair samples, and the truth. The man in custody was Ted Bundy. By now, his name was national news. Reporters swarmed courthouses. Cameras rolled at every appearance. This trial, particularly for the Chi Omega murders, became the first nationally televised homicide trial in U.S. history. And Bundy? He basked in the spotlight. He represented himself. cross-examined witnesses, smiled for the cameras, flirted with journalists. To him, the courtroom wasn't a place of reckoning. It was a stage, and he was the star. But the evidence was overwhelming. Bundy's fingerprints were found at the Chi Omega house. Witnesses placed him in Tallahassee. And then there was that bite mark. Jurors were horrified. In July of 1979, the verdict came swiftly. Guilty. On all counts. He was sentenced to death for the Chi Omega murders. Another death sentence would follow for the murder of Kimberly Leach. For most, it would be the end. For Bundy, it was just another transformation. From killer to prisoner. From fugitive to media obsession. But behind the smile, behind the smooth-talking interviews, Ted Bundy knew what was coming. The chair waited. And it would not be long. By 1979, the myth of Ted Bundy, the charming drifter, the elusive killer, had collided with the unyielding wall of justice. He faced his first trial in Miami for the Chi Omega sorority house attacks. 2 young women murdered. 2 more left clinging to life. The evidence was devastating. Eyewitnesses, forensic matches, and most damning of all, an unmistakable bite mark left by Bundy on Lisa Levy's body, which matched his dental impression perfectly. But what should have been a somber reckoning took on the strange tone of theater. Bundy, obsessed with control to the very end, insisted on representing himself. He grilled witnesses, interrupted proceedings. At times, he treated the courtroom like a classroom, correcting prosecutors, flirting with reporters, even smiling for the cameras as if he were on a talk show, not on trial for murder. But his charm had worn thin. The jury saw through the performance. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. Still, Bundy had more trials ahead. In 1980, he faced judgment once again, this time for the abduction and murder of 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. There was no pretense of flirtation now, no room for charisma, only evidence, pain, and an unbearable silence when jurors were shown photos of Kimberly's small, lifeless body. A third death sentence followed. 3 separate rulings. 3 separate courts, each one agreeing Ted Bundy deserved to die. But the death penalty in America doesn't move quickly, and Bundy knew how to use time as a weapon. He filed appeals, delayed proceedings, gave interviews, married Carolyn Boone, one of his supporters, during a bizarre courtroom stunt in which he exploited a Florida law stating that a declaration of marriage in court, in the presence of a judge, constituted a legal marriage. Boone gave birth to a daughter in 1982, whom she claimed was fathered by Bundy during a prison visit. Behind the bars, Bundy wrote long, rambling letters, many to his cousin Edna. He maintained his innocence, then hinted at guilt. His words were riddled with misdirection. He remained a master manipulator, even from death row. But as the years passed, public patience thinned. The survivors, the families of victims, many had waited over a decade for justice. And in the final weeks before his execution, Bundy seemed to know it was over. He began to talk. Slowly, calculatingly, Bundy confessed. 30 murders. Names, locations, dates. Yet even in his confessions, he was vague, cryptic, doling out truth like currency, hoping to buy more time. It didn't work. On January 24, 1989, just after 7 a.m., Ted Bundy was led from his cell to the electric chair at Florida State Prison. He had spent nearly a decade delaying the inevitable. Now, the end had come. Witnesses said he looked pale, hollow. Gone was the cocky swagger, the smirk, the courtroom bravado. In its place stood a man finally stripped of his masks. Bundy declined a special meal, said a final prayer, and then silence. The current surged. 1,000 volts. Then another, and then stillness. Outside the prison gates, a crowd had gathered. Hundreds of people cheered. Some held signs, "Burn Bundy, burn." Others banged drums. Fireworks exploded in the morning sky. For them, this wasn't just justice. It was release. But inside the minds of those who had followed his crimes, who had lost sisters, daughters, friends, there was no celebration. Only questions. How did he do it for so long? How did no one see it? How many more are still unknown? And most haunting of all, how many others, like Bundy, walk among us now, smiling, helping, hiding? Ted Bundy was dead, but the fear he left behind was very much alive. For all the headlines, the courtroom drama, the public fascination, the true story of Ted Bundy doesn't live in the pages of newspapers or trial transcripts. It lives in the survivors, the women who faced him, who lived through the nightmare, who carry the scars, seen and unseen, to this day. Kathy Kleiner was just 20 years old on the night Ted Bundy entered the Chi Omega sorority house in Tallahassee. She had been fast asleep in her room when Bundy crept in. What happened next was beyond brutal. He struck her in the face with a piece of firewood, shattering her jaw, breaking bones, leaving her unconscious and bloodied on the floor. But she survived. When she woke up in the hospital, she had no memory of the attack. Doctors wired her jaw shut. She couldn't speak for weeks. But slowly, painfully, Kathy began to reclaim her life. Years later, she would say, "He didn't take away my spirit. He didn't take away who I am." She went on to marry, have a career, and speak publicly about her experience, not to relive the pain, but to own it, to remind the world that survivors are not defined by the violence done to them. They are defined by what they choose to do next. Carol Duranch was different. Her story began in a Utah shopping mall. A man approached her, claiming to be a police officer, said her car had been broken into, asked her to come with him. She got in the car. What happened next was a blur: terror, confusion, struggle. He tried to handcuff her, tried to drag her toward his car, but Carol fought back. She kicked, scratched, screamed. And in a moment of sheer willpower, she broke free. She survived. And she didn't just walk away, she testified. With strength, with clarity, and her courage gave prosecutors the key they needed to put Bundy behind bars. Carol Duranch's testimony was the first crack in his facade. It was her voice that pierced through the lies, and her story became a turning point in the case, a moment where the narrative began to shift, where Bundy's mask began to slip. But not every survivor had the chance to speak. Many of Bundy's victims were never found. Others were silenced forever. And those who were close to them, friends, siblings, parents, carried a different kind of trauma, a wound that never fully heals. For the survivors, the journey didn't end with Bundy's arrest or his execution. The trauma lingered. Nightmares, anxiety, a lifelong battle with trust. Some, like Kathy, turned their pain into purpose. Others chose privacy, seeking to rebuild quietly, away from the cameras. But all of them, every single one, lives with the knowledge of what they endured, what they escaped, and what could have been. Psychologists call it survivor's guilt, PTSD, trauma response. But survivors? They just call it life. And while Bundy has become a symbol of evil, of manipulation, of horror, these women remain the forgotten heroes of the story. They're the ones who faced the unimaginable and lived to tell the tale. Their stories remind us that evil is real, but so is resilience. And sometimes, even in the darkest places, courage rises. Long after the final verdict was read, after the prison gates closed, and after the electric chair hummed with finality, Ted Bundy's story continued. Not because the world needed to remember him, but because it couldn't forget. Bundy's legacy is unlike any other in the annals of American crime. He didn't just haunt the memories of those who knew his victims. He embedded himself into the DNA of our culture, our justice system, our media, our understanding of evil itself. In 1980, Rule published A Stranger Beside Me, a chilling, personal account of working side by side with Bundy at a crisis hotline center in Seattle. She had called him a friend, trusted him, and then watched in disbelief as his horrifying double life came to light. Her book was a revelation, not just because of its proximity to Bundy, but because it forced readers to confront an uncomfortable truth. Evil can wear a friendly face. Years later, in a new era of streaming and viral content, the story was resurrected again. Netflix's Conversations with a Killer. The Ted Bundy tapes gave the world front row access to Bundy's own voice. Pulled from hours of death row interviews, the docuseries painted a picture of a man both disturbingly calm and endlessly manipulative, offering chilling insights, always one step removed from full confession. Then came Extremely Wicked, Shockingly Evil and Vile, a film starring Zac Efron that stirred controversy for its portrayal of Bundy. Critics argued it glamorized him. Others said it forced viewers to reckon with why they were so fascinated by him in the first place. And on HBO, Crazy, Not Insane turned the spotlight onto those who studied Bundy, particularly forensic psychiatrist Dr. Dorothy Lewis, who questioned not just what Bundy did, but why. But beneath the Hollywood dramatizations and true crime fandom, the real value of Bundy's legacy, if it can be called that, lies in what he taught the justice system and what he taught us. His case helped push forward the science of criminal profiling. Investigators began to understand that serial killers often don't look like monsters, that they blend in, plan carefully, learn from their mistakes. Bundy's crimes also led to changes in how law enforcement communicates across state lines. When he crossed borders, the system was woefully unprepared. Today, databases, shared records, and federal oversight have become standard, because they had to be. Public awareness shifted, too. In Bundy's time, hitchhiking was common. Trust was abundant. Women rarely considered the man offering to help with groceries might be a predator. That innocence died with Bundy's victims, and the world has never fully recovered it. Finally, his story reignited an ongoing debate, one that burns even now. Should we study men like Bundy, or should we silence them? Is there value in listening to a killer? In probing their mind? In trying to extract some lesson from their darkness? Or does that attention reward them? Give them the fame they craved? Bundy craved it, desperately, and in death he received it. But his fame is a warning, not a celebration. A red flag waving across decades. A reminder that monsters don't always hide under beds. Sometimes they smile, shake your hand, tell you everything you want to hear. And that's why even now we still talk about Ted Bundy, not because he deserves it, but because we do. Because every lesson learned may be the reason someone else survives. The legacy of Ted Bundy is not a name etched in infamy. It is the echo of every voice that said, "I knew something was wrong." It is the reminder to trust our instincts. And above all, it is the urgent, unflinching call to never be fooled by the mask. Ted Bundy was never the monster in the shadows. He was the man who smiled in the daylight, the well-dressed student with polite manners, the boyfriend who remembered your favorite coffee order. He shattered every stereotype we thought we understood about danger, about what evil looks like, about who we should fear. And that's what made him so terrifying. Bundy taught us that the most dangerous predator isn't the one who roars, but the one who whispers. The one who earns your trust before he takes your life. His charm was never real, it was camouflage, a mask worn to perfection. And when it finally slipped, the world saw something it could never unsee. But this story isn't just about Ted Bundy. It's about the women who didn't come home, the ones whose names are often forgotten in the shadow of his. It's about the survivors who endured hell and stood back up, who took the stand, who told their stories, who refused to let him have the final word. It's about law enforcement learning to share information, forensic science evolving, and society finally starting to believe victims when they say, "I don't feel safe." Bundy is gone, but the lessons remain. Be vigilant. Trust your instincts. Listen when someone tells you they're afraid. And above all, support survivors. Believe them. Stand with them. Because evil doesn't always come with a warning sign. Sometimes it smiles. If you found this story as haunting and important as we did, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which part of Bundy's story left you stunned. What part shook you the most? Your voice matters here, and we'll be listening.